Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very, very welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Seán Finan. I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. So this morning we present to you webinar number 45 in our bioenergy webinar series. And today and this morning we discussed the Biomethane Strategy, which was launched last week. This morning's webinar will give you some insights from industry and from stakeholders on their thoughts on the strategy, some feedback, and also some analysis. Obviously, this is we're also open to taking your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to post any questions you have through the Q&A tab. Before we move on to the actual main content of this morning's webinar, just a very brief introduction to the Irish Bioenergy Association. The association was established in 1999. We work on behalf of the bioenergy industry on the island of Ireland, and our membership covers the sectors of biomass, biogas, biomethane, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels, and energy crops. Our main work is in the area of policy lobbying and advocacy, and we have a role around information transfer, knowledge transfer, but also providing general assistance to members, but also broader stakeholders. Further information is available on our website, www.irbea.org. Just to brief you quickly, we also have a fact sheet series, so if there's anyone interested in looking at that, all our fact sheets are available on our website, covering the basic bioenergy sectors. And this series we're hoping to develop further over the coming months and years. We also have all of our previous webinars available to view or to look at on our YouTube channel, but also on our website. You can go back on any of the recordings of any of the topics. So as you can see, there's quite a diverse range of topics have been covered so far through our webinar series. And again, we're also open to having any of you as attendees present at a webinar on a particular topic or a particular technology option that you have or project. So feel free to get in touch with us if you would like to present on a future webinar. So getting back to the agenda for this morning, we will have a few high-level points on the biomethane strategy, which I will present to you myself, and then we will have a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. And as I said, anyone that wants to submit a question can do it through the Q&A tab, and we will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible. We will run until 10:30, but if the level of questioning and the discussion merits going to 11:15, we will continue to 11:15. Just also to remind you that the recording of this webinar will be available, and the link will be circulated to all registered attendees in the coming days. And it will also be available on our YouTube channel and our website afterwards in the coming days. We haven't set a date for our next webinar, but it more than likely will take place over the next couple of weeks. And again, running the Wednesday from 9:30 to 10:30, and the next topic is yet to be confirmed. So just very briefly, what the Irish Bioenergy Association does on behalf of biogas, biomethane members. So we have about 50 members directly involved in the biogas, biomethane sector, and they vary from farmers to feedstock suppliers, biogas plant operators, developers, technology providers, and equipment manufacturers and suppliers, and a broad range of service providers to the industry, from consultants to analytics companies to financial providers, etc. So we have provided a detailed response and a number of submissions to the consultation that was held on the biomethane strategy, but also prior to that, in terms of our active engagement with KPMG, but also the various different departments involved in the development of this strategy. We did actively engage with the Department of Agriculture officials during the development of the strategy, and we do thank the Department of Agriculture officials for their ongoing engagement with us during that process. And we will continue to engage as an organisation on behalf of our members and in consultation with our members through the next stages of the rollout of the biomethane industry in Ireland, and as the strategy is implemented. So our panelists this morning, we have Paddy Phelan, who's the IrBEA President and CEO of the South East Energy Agency, and Paddy will share his perspective from a policy and energy perspective. We also will hear from Declan Murray, the CEO at Biocore, who will share his thoughts from a biogas producer stroke developer's perspective. We're delighted to welcome Cathal Fitzgerald, co-founder and director of Bruin Private and currently chairman of Arigna Fuels, who will speak about the funding and investment area. We're also delighted to be joined by Paul O'Brien, who is the South Leinster chairman of the Irish Farmers Association, who will share a farming and farmers' perspective, which is very important in the overall discussion. And then Noel Gavigan, our technical executive, will share his perspective from a technical point of view. So moving on, the National Biomethane Strategy. So there's a set 5.7 terawatt-hour target by 2030. That's been set out in the strategy. There's a very strong focus in the strategy about a farmer-centric approach or farmer-centric focus. And that's critical. We need to have farmers involved in this sector, involved at all levels of the sector, potentially involved at supplying feedstocks, but also involved if farmers want to coalesce or individually develop facilities themselves. The Department of Agriculture has outlined that there will be a €40 million capital budget set aside for the initial phase of the implementation of the strategy, and that has been announced. And alongside the capital budget, a key component of the mobilisation of the sector is the renewable heat obligation design, which is expected in Q3 of 2024. So we await the design of that, which will be a critical component in terms of mobilising the sector. We understand that the expression of interest for the capital grants is open up to the 15th of July 2024. So it closes on the 15th of July. So, and there is a link available on the SEI website to submit an expression of interest. And again, if anyone has any questions on that, please get in touch with us and we can happy to engage with SEI or indeed the Department of Ag around that. We understand that the budget drawdown has to take place in 2025 and 2026. So there's quite a time limit on the initial phase of funding. And we understand that there's no minimal scale of facility, in that if you're a farmer wanting to build a biogas plant on your farm or a multi-megawatt facility by a co-op or a private enterprise, there's no minimal or maximum scale of facility that can be developed through the project or through the strategy. The strategy outlines some key pillars, and these are all critical components for the successful implementation of the strategy. Sustainability is a key piece, and obviously the Renewable Energy Directive governs the sustainability of the sector, which is important. The demand for biomethane is a crucial element because we have to ensure that there's mechanisms which will increase and encourage and drive demand for biomethane, and that in itself linked in with setting a market price for the biomethane itself. Bioeconomy and circular economy is a huge focus within the strategy and an important focus for bioenergy and indeed the biomethane sector in terms of making better use of waste and residue resources, but also the potential for use of various different types of crops and other things to produce biogas and biomethane. And then the enhanced focus on digestate, but also the focus on biogenic CO2 and the other benefits that come from a biomethane sector. And then obviously a crucial component of any industry is the economics of the sector. And we will talk about that more broadly in our panel discussion, but ultimately it has to be economically viable to produce biomethane, and we can discuss that further in a few minutes. As I said earlier, the 2024-2025 period sets out the initial grant program, which is a Department of Ag provided fund. That is hoping it will contribute 1 terawatt of biomethane, indigenous biomethane. And then there is proposals for further grant support programs from 2026 to 2030. Obviously, the renewable heat obligation driving that is a critical measure, but also what they say in the additional grant support program is that will be provided by Department of Environment, Climate Action and Communications, but details to be announced in 2025. So that's causing a little bit of uncertainty within the industry from the perspective of not that there isn't a clear pathway as to what funding will be available beyond the initial grant program. What I don't understand is that the that this mentions that this enhanced program will only contribute 1.5. So 1 and 1.5 is 2.5, which is still a good bit short of the 5.7. So I don't know what the proposal is to incentivize the additional volume up to 5.7. The strategy outlines a number of deployment scenarios. Scenario 1, widespread deployment; 2, current policies only; and 3, economic deployment. I'm not going to go through this table, but basically in summary, what the strategy favours is scenario 1 and scenario 3. So scenario 1 are smaller plants, and scenario 3 are quite sizable plants, large plants. So it favours a combination of both. And this table is available in the strategy. There are many other aspects associated and within the strategy which are very important, but due to time limitations this morning, we're not necessarily going to go into them all, but they will arise, most of the discussion points, during the panel discussion. Some general feedback from IrBEA and our members on the strategy in 4 or 5 slides, and then we'll go to the panel discussion. So we welcome the strategy. That's an important first step, but do stress that further market certainty is required to attract investment. And that's a critical component. And by further market certainty, we mean certainty in terms of funding, certainty in terms of the renewable heat obligation, and indeed certainty across a number of other areas which are very, very important as well, around regulation, but also around permitting, licensing, all of those areas. The government's role, in our opinion, is to provide the necessary conditions to attract investment and ensure that the long-term viability and financial sustainability of the sector. Capital grants and the renewable heat obligation are the two components that have been chosen as the mechanism to mobilise the sector. We are concerned regarding the capital grants mechanism, and IrBEA members favoured an ongoing operational support mechanism. And the reason for that is that these plants need an ongoing feeding and maintenance, have an ongoing feeding and maintenance requirement. And the lack of an ongoing support fundamentally questions the AD plant economic viability and if that viability exists. And we'll discuss that further as well with our panel. Moving on to the next slide, just in terms of capital grants, members are very clearly saying to us that capital grants will drive up technology cost, which is a concern, that the overall fund would be limited, which is true. It's 40 million in the initial phase, and we have no certainty as to the volume of capital that will be available for the future phases. There will be strong competition for any capital grants, maybe not necessarily in the first phase, because it's time limited, and it will also favour people that have planning permission currently. But we do see strong competition in the future for any further capital grants. So that could result in some projects being excluded. So, and those projects being excluded could be the ones that might be viable, and the ones that aren't may potentially get funding. So that's a whole area that needs to be explored. What's the plan for funding beyond the initial phase? That's a critical question. And just to be very clear, the reason our members are we're pushing for some form of an ongoing support or operational support was that the ongoing or operational support has been the mechanism of choice that has been deployed across Europe in developing markets and also in established markets. The Danish model is lauded within the strategy, but the Danish model was built on an ongoing support mechanism. In fact, they're about to introduce another ongoing support mechanism in the coming months, we understand. And the renewable heat obligation is an obligation on fossil fuel suppliers to include a percentage of renewable fuel in their mix, in the fuel mix. Again, this isn't clear. Is it fossil fuel suppliers, or is it all fossil fuel suppliers, or is it renewable gas or biomethane, or is it all renewable fuels? So the expectation is that it will roll out similar to the way the renewable transport fuel obligation currently rolls out. However, we can learn a lot from the renewable transport fuel obligation, in that it's only in the last year or two, or really now, that the obligation is ensuring that obligated parties have to work harder in terms of how did they secure their fuel or their certs to fulfill the obligation. So we can learn a lot from the implementation of that over the last 10 years, and we can, the critical components of a renewable heat obligation are that the threshold is, the worry is that the threshold will be set at a low level, but it needs to be set at a low level in order for most of the fossil fuel market to be obligated. The percentage obligation is very important because that shows the ambition up to 2030, and that will generate the demand for biomethane or indeed renewable fuels. What type of renewable fuels will be allowed to fulfill the obligation? We're not clear. That's not clear, and it needs to be clarified in the design. And then will it be indigenous biomethane? Will it be imported as well? Will imported fuels be eligible as well? So there's a lot of questions there. And another critical component is the buyout rate. So there needs to be a situation where the buyout rate is a lot more unfavorable compared to buying the fuels. So the buyout rate needs to be high. And I suppose fundamentally our members are asking when will we have an RHO design, and why the delay? Why was the RHO design and high level parameters not outlined within the biomethane strategy, considering that we did this consultation on the RHO back maybe about last September, August, September, and that was the second consultation. So there's some frustration across the membership around why the RHO has not been kind of the broad design parameters outlined within the strategy. Moving on, just one or two other slides. Digestate presents a considerable opportunity for Ireland. There are regulatory challenges around with the nitrates directive and the 170 kilogram limit in terms of replacing inorganic chemical fertilizer with organic digestate. This is all associated with the renewer proposal from a European level, and we understand that there could be movement around the nitrates directive and the implementation of that from the point of view of using digestate on land and displacing chemical fertilizer. There are some strategic risks which we feel haven't been covered in the strategy. The strategic risks we see and our members see is the issue of imported fuels. This could be imported biomethane fuel or certificates, or indeed the importation of hydrotreated vegetable oil or HVO. HVO is a drop-in fuel. It's cheaper than biomethane. So these are all strategic risks for the development of the sector, which we feel haven't been explored within the strategy and should have been explored. We also take issue with Minister Ryan's statement from where he suggests there will be a considerable reduction in gas usage by the mid-2030s. No evidence has been provided within the strategy as to the basis for this, and he does very clearly fairly clearly say that that as we shift our economy away from fossil fuel in favor of electrification, that's his exact quote. But as we know, the electricity system is very, very dependent on gas to balance intermittent generation. So we just think that his statement is unrealistic from the perspective of reduction in gas usage. IrBEA welcomes the recognition that different sizes and scales of AD plant will be required. However, different sizes and AD plants have different economic considerations and requirements, but we do recognize that it's not a focus on a singular size, or it's open to the developer to specify what size of plant they propose to develop. My final slide. We welcome the recognition of the existing AD plant operators within the strategy and how they will be eligible to apply for capital funding to upgrade to purchase upgrading equipment to produce biomethane from the biogas that they're currently producing. So that's to be welcomed. There was absolutely no recognition or mention whatsoever of the existing AD plant operators in the initial draft of the strategy. And these members and individuals and companies have invested over 200 million euros in the existing biogas plants which are in operation in Ireland. IrBEA welcomes the opportunity and potential for biogas transport directly to users, while the gas grid is a critical and crucial strategic infrastructure. There will be other opportunities for people maybe to supply biogas directly or biomethane directly to consumers. So we welcome that opportunity and mention within the strategy. IrBEA says the biomethane sustainability charter must be developed by active and meaningful engagement with the industry. It can't be just a case that there's a document circulated and it's open for public consultation, and then the biomethane strategy is actually, or the biomethane sustainability charter is then published. this has to be through meaningful engagement. Meaningful engagement to us as we sit down in rooms with stakeholders, with people that are involved in the development of this charter, because this charter will be a crucial component in terms of whether we actually get off the ground or not, and whether whether the industry can grow and develop. We are concerned that there is not one mention in any of the actions that industry or their representatives are recognised as stakeholders in any of the actions. So the word industry isn't even mentioned. And by industry, I mean biogas plant operators, potentially farmers, farm organisations. So the industry is not mentioned in any of the actions, and that's a concern. How will the industry feed into the implementation group, the biomethane charter, and any of the actions? And how will the biomethane implementation group interact with industry? They are all crucial questions which are not answered within the strategy, but need to be considered by government in order for the successful mobilisation. So I'm going to leave it at there. My contact details are there. You can contact us any time if you have any questions or feedback. But I'm now going to open up and I invite our panelists to maybe switch on their cameras. And I go to Paddy first. So Paddy, just by way of introduction to yourself, you are the IrBEA President and CEO of the Southeast Energy Agency, and also Executive Committee member of the Wind Farmers Association. And your day-to-day work would see you interacting and working from a policy and from a energy perspective in your role. So can you give us your feedback and thoughts maybe on the strategy, Paddy, and where you see the strategy going, and your high-level feedback?
Thank you, Seán, and welcome everybody on behalf of the members of the Irish Bioenergy Association and the Council and Directors. And thank you, Seán, for a comprehensive set of slides there, and looking forward to engaging over the coming months with the department and the various actors to brainstorm really essentially why, I suppose, in our view and our overwhelming view on foot of the release of the strategy, that it's just not going to quite cut the mustard in terms of incentivizing the sector. What's the basis for it? Fundamentally, if you look right across Europe, if you look right across the European energy markets, and you look at the models around which energy markets are built and constructed, the element of a support or a contract for difference is a key pillar right across Europe in terms of all electricity and energy markets. And the CapEx grant is somewhat an old form, a forgotten form. In fact, if memory serves me right, and I recall, the economists recommend that you don't go the CapEx route because ultimately it results in a higher CapEx. So a operating support, or CFD, contract for difference, is the term that's used. And then if you look at the new markets around electricity over the past 5 to 7 years, you see the pillars in terms of redesigning the energy markets are both power purchase agreements and contracts for difference. And the contracts for difference are a support that gives you a guaranteed price for your power, for your energy. The fact that this is a liquid or gaseous form of energy should make no difference. It's a renewable form of energy, cemented in Renewable Energy Directive 3. Bioenergy, biomethane, biogas, biomass are all certified as renewable, and therefore are a key pillar in the overall European strategy to decarbonize the continent ahead of all other continents and sustain its economic competitiveness and energy security. The other background to this is that we still continue to import over 80% of our energy from oil and gas from abroad. And really, we, even in the Southeast Energy Agency, have identified a resource mapping, the opportunity for up to 14% of the energy, total energy of the region, which is representing about 1/8 of the population, can and could and should be produced from circular economy source renewable biomethane. So at a very outset, I just want to, I suppose, commend Seán and his team for the constant harangue and harassing of the departments over the past 4 or 5 years. It is a positive that we finally have a biomethane or a bioenergy strategy. That's a real positive. It is great to see that across government there is a commitment and understanding that this is a real solution. If we look across Europe and how they have plotted their way towards their 2030, and many in the case have achieved and succeeded in their 2020 renewable energy targets, over 40% of their renewable energy targets have been met through the vector of bioenergy. In Ireland, we've been wholly reliant on a cost-optimal approach to electricity markets, and we've seen in the last year's RES 3 announcements, the RES 3 auctions, that the number of projects that are competing for very, very tight contracts on energy CFDs has fallen dramatically behind what the Climate Action Plan requires. So fundamentally, very positive that there is a stake in the ground now for a target around biogas, biomethane, bioenergy. It is, I think, fair to say, following review and consultation with members and discussion around the sector, and even internationally, I was out in Prague 2 weeks ago at a European Repower Industries project meeting, and they have a very established biogas and biomethane industry that got its supports almost 10 years ago. And they are achieving over 10% of their total energy from renewable biogas. And they fundamentally confirm that a CapEx grant is not going to support the model. So rather than just criticize it, I've a couple of slides and kind of bring the positives and see, well, where are the government seeing the supports that maybe we can't quite see yet. Teresa, I'll just double check that I can share, if that's possible.
We may have to give you host rights, Paddy. We can do that, yeah.
Yeah,
just can do that.
In terms of whilst I'm waiting, I'll just maybe talk about the points. So extracting from within the strategy as it stands, there's kind of 3 key points that come to mind. So in terms of the policy supports, and Seán has touched on these, I'll get the slide up now. The first item that they reference, so in addition to the CapEx grant, which it must be noted, 40 million euro, each plant, and I just referenced the Irish Farmers Journal Renewable Energy Roadshow, and Stephen Robb had produced a case study for a 30 gigawatt hour biomethane plant, which was reliant on just over 50,000 tonnes of feedstock. He had flagged a CapEx of just over 9.6 million euro. He had included for a gas price, whether that's through a CFD or supported price, of 160 euros per megawatt hour. And that demonstrated a output or a net dividend of 68,000 euro per annum, which was particularly underwhelming, I think is the phrase I would use, in terms of appetite for finance or appetite for other forms. So hopefully my slides are sharing there now.
Yeah, you're sharing, yeah.
I'll just go into display mode. So looking at it across the opportunities, I've just pulled out some slides here with some notes in relation to the specific policy. So the supports for delivering my biomethane according to the strategy document I have extracted to be these main points. The renewable heat obligation, which is the responsibility of DEC, and it is due in Q3 2024. The grant support, correct me if I'm wrong, Seán, is the responsibility of DAFM.
Yeah, that's correct.
The biomethane sustainability charter is defined and specified in the European Renewable Energy Directive. And I would recommend people reference revision 3, not revision 2. So RED 3 was signed off by the European Commission last June, and Ireland has 2 years to adopt its findings. And therefore, again, Noel might touch on whether or not there's been any upgrades in terms of sustainability element calculations, but I would recommend anybody who's looking at this to consider the Renewable Energy Directive revision 3, Revision 2 is almost 6-7 years old now, just to make sure you're not caught there. The next item, which is going to be absolutely critical, is the green gas certification scheme. So currently that is in the hands of Gas Networks Ireland and is currently restricted to gas grid injected. And gas grid injected CapEx is a significant portion of the overall costs. As we know from experience across the electricity energy system, where you want to get a grid connection from the ESB or ESB networks, if you're on the distribution grid, or if you're involved at a higher level of transmission grid through air grid, there's a competitive process there, and you can go and get third-party costs to try and manage that cost of connection. G&I are the holders of the connection costings, and initial estimates are that you could be paying significant grid connection costs to connect to a gas grid. So that really needs to be looked at. And at a European level, a number up to 10 years ago or more were fully funded by the state to get farmers up to 500 kilowatts connected to the grid from an electricity perspective. Maybe there's something there in terms of reducing the cost of the gas network's connection. So gas certification. So without the green gas certificate, you won't be able to avail of the clean energy supports, which may arise from CO2 emissions trading scheme or other voluntary trading schemes. So without that certificate, you're unlikely to get any of the proposed uplifts that might be available to you for your product because it needs to be certified as green or renewable. The others are, there are other European biogas certification houses that are operational throughout Europe and through our networks in European Biogas Association and others. There are other actors that can certify in other jurisdictions. And really, we need to open up that certification and make sure that it's mentioned in the strategy that, for example, the road transported gas that's used for heat, in the southeast, for Kilkenny County Council and for Wexford Fire Station, that can and should be certified as clean also, because it's ultimately meeting their decarbonisation targets as a public sector body to achieve 51% reduction in emissions by 2030. So without us being able to certify that gas, which is transported through a virtual pipeline in canisters, that will not be accountable against their decarbonisation. Carbon capture, again, this is ultimately going to come to industry and academia. How can we create a supply chain where there's a value in terms of capturing CO2? And the CO2 that's taken off a biomethane plant, typically used for industrial use, we're seeing prices in Europe at 20-25 euros a tonne. It would, be small in comparison to what's required in terms of supplementing the production of biomethane. Biorefining, that's another policy tool they refer to in the strategy. Multi-species swords, which come back to the farmers, and that's ultimately to reduce nitrates and increase production of grasses from natural forms. And then really fundamentally the digestate management. So establishing the governance structures around how we manage that digestate. So there's an awful lot of conversation being had and completed across Europe in how to manage that digestate very efficiently and how to get the best from it. From that 50-odd thousand tonnes of feedstock, you're going to have 40-odd thousand tonnes of digestate, and what's the best use for it, and where under management legislation as an agricultural residue, where is it best placed to be used? So really, in addition, and I think this is the important point to bring a positive note, in addition to the CapEx support, which is 40 million euro across 5 terawatt hours is quite small. And as you mentioned, Seán, it's required to be expended between 25 and 26 in terms of budgetary process. That's really not going to scratch much of the surface of the potential for bioenergy that's out there, and biomethane particularly. So then if you tot up all of these other areas which are identified as opportunities for further subvention or further support or value add, as maybe the phrase should be best placed, a lot of these actions are awaiting clarification and awaiting really valuation. But if we throw our eyes across, and that's one of the opportunities we have through this Repower Industry project we have in Europe, which kicked off last month in Prague, we see a lot of existing actors in Europe which have biomethane up and running, and really identifying where the value add is. And it's critical that we understand that these are variable markets. The price of carbon, the price of certificates goes up and down every day depending on the ETS program. So really, the RHO is something we really need to understand well. But fundamentally, it's a market which can rise and fall. So it brings me back to my crystallizing point that we really need a contract for difference around that gas price. And really, we need that set in accordance with the CFD process or contract for difference, a guaranteed price.
And at that, we seem to have lost Paddy, but we have he's the main thrust of his points. So next up is Declan. Declan Murray works with CEO at Biocore Environmental, bringing a biogas producer stroke developer perspective, and Declan operates a biogas plant at Tibohan, County Roscommon. So Declan, do you want to just tell us a small bit about Biocore first of all, and then we get your thoughts on the strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Seán. Good morning, everybody. And thanks to Paddy there. That was a very succinct presentation there, which captured a lot of the difficulties we see going forward. But anyway, Biocore Environmental, we commenced operation in 2011. We are an anaerobic digestion development and operations company. As Seán said there, we currently have an operational plant in Roscommon, in Tibohan, just outside Ballahadreen, currently electrical to the grid. Our plans for that are to double the size of it and hopefully go to gas upgrading and start putting some renewable gas into the grid. We have approximately 10 projects at various stages of development ready to go, and hopefully we'll see some of them happening in the next period of time. I think the difficulty will be trying to find a way of funding them, given the less than stellar document that has just been produced by the department. So I think really to give a kind of an operator stroke developer's view on it, I think I would be probably backing up almost everything that Paddy has said. I think item number one is first of all the fact that we have a grant seems to make no sense at all. We have the most underdeveloped anaerobic digestion industry in Europe by a long way. We're not just lagging; we're not at the races with most of Europe, to be honest with you. And to have a grant structure will do one thing and one thing only, and let's be absolutely clear on this. If all my suppliers know I'm getting a 20% grant, I can absolutely guarantee you my prices will go up by 20%. That it goes without saying. They're all watching this probably with greater interest than I am, because I think in terms of a 20% capital grant for building a plant, when you're looking at plant sizes which have a capital investment of 20-25 million, the 20%, while welcome, will be eaten up both in inflation and additional prices. So in terms of ongoing operational expenses, it'll have little or no impact, to be honest with you. And I think where we haven't had any real engagement, we've heard a lot of good words from the government. In terms of developing an industry, you need two things. You need to have a price or a market for your product, whatever that industry is, that you can sell it, and you can sell it at a margin that will cover your costs and allow you to develop further. I think the renewable heat obligation may bring us to a position where the cost of producing renewable gas is covered by the users having to purchase renewable gas. But again, we don't know what the terms of that will be. Can we bring renewable gas in from Holland, from wherever? Or does it have to be indigenous renewable gas? If it has to be indigenous renewable gas, there's some hope of producing a market. But the reality on where we're at the moment with a biomethane strategy is we welcome it. The government have finally turned their face towards the fact that we need an anaerobic digestion industry. There is no other way of producing renewable gas. That's the facts. It can only be produced through the anaerobic digestion industry. However, the lack of engagement with the industry and the lack of any real change in driving policy is very concerning. We have various issues in the country at the moment, ranging from lack of housing to data centers going to take all our power, etc., etc., etc. And really, all of this comes back to a couple of fundamental issues. There is a broken planning system where building a once-off house in Clare has the same amount of weight stroke ability to stop it as a renewable energy business or a massive industrial development. We have a licensing and permitting program which is being applied to the anaerobic digestion industry on exactly the same basis as it is being applied elsewhere. And I mean, examples of that would be having to reach standards in the food industry for human consumption are being applied to the anaerobic digestion industry to produce digestate to put on a field. So it literally makes no sense, and all it does is it drives the costs higher and higher. We look at the green certification and how that's going to work in Ireland. At the moment, we're very concerned that Gas Networks Ireland appear to be the ones that have complete control of it. And while that's fine, if you're injecting gas into their grid, how do we handle all the industries who use gas that are not on the grid? I mean, I have one mile down the road from me in Roscommon who is quite happy to buy my gas off me, but can't because we have no way of dealing with the renewable credentials of that gas, and because it's not going into the grid, Gas Networks Ireland don't want to talk to us, and Gas Networks Ireland don't have a grid in the area. And the grid, the Irish National Gas Grid, is quite small. It doesn't cover a lot of the country, and therefore there is going to be a requirement absolutely to have big heat users have an ability to buy gas directly from either co-located biogas plants or biogas plants that are very close by. But if we don't have a gas grid, we can't get certification, and therefore we can't get the renewable quantities of that gas, I suppose, counted in the national calculations. And then we hear a lot of talk about things like carbon capture, and I think Paddy, touched on it there recently in his slides. And I mean, I think people need to understand the basic economic fundamentals of carbon capture. Carbon capture equipment costs approximately €2 million. It's very hard to get kit for less than that. On a 40 gigawatt plant, you would probably produce around 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. If you're getting €20 per ton, you don't need a degree in economics to figure out that no one is going to spend £2 million to generate 80 grand or 100 grand or whatever it is a year. It's just not going to work. So some of the stuff that's been talked about from an economic point of view is not going to work and never will work. And that's down to how you certify the CO2, the biogenic CO2, after you've captured it. But, however, I do remain hopeful from the point of view that the renewable heat obligation will deal with creating a market for the gas, because the only way we're going to get to a point that people will plow money into building anaerobic digesters in the country is to have a guaranteed offtake at a guaranteed price for a guaranteed length of time, which would be standard throughout the whole of Europe. And the fact that Ireland has decided not to have an ongoing support is frankly quite amazing, because no other market in Europe did that. So I don't know what the Irish people who are in charge of this have seen that nobody in Europe has seen. So maybe we've got some great insights here that I'm not aware exist anywhere else. And we operate in a lot of different markets in Europe, and our feedback from all our partners throughout Europe would be, it's not going to work, forget about it. You're not going to get any industry off the ground. So I think from a developer's point of view, yes, there is some hope. From an operational point of view, we look at the scenarios presented within the document, where you have scenario 1 and scenario 2 showing a deliverability of very low to not possible, and you have scenario 3 as possibly able to deliver some of the renewable gas requirements. If you take a scenario 3 plant, which is a 40 gigawatt plant, first of all, 60,000 tons of feedstock won't hack it. Let me tell you that, lads. At 40 gigawatts, you're at somewhere in the region of 75 to 80,000 tons because of the variability of gas output from the feedstocks. And in order to make these things attractive to everybody, we gotta have a much closer relationship with the farming industry. With all the farmers in Ireland are suffering a lot from derogation at the moment and all these various things coming down the tracks at them. But we still have quite a ridiculous situation where you can take a ton of slurry out of a tank on a farm and you can spread it on your field, or alternatively, go down the road to a farmer who has some availability and spread it on his field. However, the minute you come in the gate to me, it becomes a waste. So how does that make sense? That doesn't make sense to anybody, but these are the things we have to deal with. But unless if we're going to stick with a purely capital-based grant, we need to look at the cost of producing the plant, which are both planning and permitting. We need to look at the operational cost of the plant and how we assist the real end users of our product, which is digestate farmers, to be able to use AD to reduce their requirements under the nitrogen directives and also reduce their costs from being able to use digestate as an organic fertilizer. And in order for that to work, we need to have an integrated approach to this, and I do not see any indication that that's what's happening. So that's my
Thanks very much, Declan, for that those insights. We'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. I'll move to Cathal and then we'll move to Paul. So Cathal, thanks again for joining us this morning. And if you could talk to us from a funding and stroke investment perspective, you're co-founder and director of Bruin Private and chairman of Arigna Fuels, entrepreneur and investor in the finance and sustainability sectors. I know your company is based in Dublin, but also with interest in other countries as well. So if you could just maybe explain to us, maybe introduce your company, what you do as a starting point, Carl, that would be very useful.
Sure. Thanks, Seán, and thanks to the previous panelists. Quite interesting. Bruin Private is a boutique corporate finance based here in Dublin, and we finance lots of different types of projects, from solar to property to also tech as well. So we're sort of quite multidisciplined. From time to time, we will invest in a project ourselves, and it's in that capacity that I'm chairman of Arigna Fuels. Most of you will have heard of Arigna Fuels and be familiar with it as being a producer of smokeless coal. What might be less well known is that it has one of the largest biochar production facilities in the world. So, and that's how we got involved. So we organized the funding for two 35,000 metric ton machines that were purchased from the States and commissioned late last year. So we produce biochar primarily as a biofuel, as a replacement for coal, but also we're engaging in a number of trials now as biochar as for other uses, carbon insetting into UPVC and other building materials. Also, interestingly enough, on a sort of a non-food, non-agricultural fertilizer-based project as well, which will be interesting to watch. But the area that's of primary interest to us is anaerobic digestion, and it's for three reasons. One is that biochar, if you read up on it, has many applications, and a lot of research has been done, particularly in the United States. And in anaerobic digestion, it has three uses. One is as a soil additive. So if you apply biochar in conjunction with a fertilizer, organic or not, it can enhance grass yields quite significantly, it retains moisture and reduces nutrient runoff. The other one area that's of interest to us, and there's a test going to run over the summer here, is as an additive to AD itself. So when you add the biochar of a specific quality and in specific quantities, you enhance gas yields by up to 30%. And then the final one is that is dealing with the digestate. I understand that the digestate can be used as an organic fertilizer. In some cases, I think particularly up the north, what they're finding is that they just end up with too much of it. So what we're doing is looking at using the digestate itself as an input into the biochar process, and thus sort of make it circular. So that's Bruin and Arigna. In terms of my knowledge of biomethane is limited. But that being said, I understand enough about let's call it the industry in general, and I understand a lot about finance, having spent all my career in finance, both here in the United States, to understand what's fundable and what's not fundable. My first comment on the national biomethane strategy is as follows: is that when you look at the length of the document and what it covers, and I take Declan's point about what it doesn't cover, but you note that there's a very short paragraph on page 20 which covers financing, which is surprising in a way, because if you've taken away, let's call it a key support mechanism, which is, let's call it price support, and understanding, or if you do understand the impact that has on your financing of such projects, you should have a big long section on financing and dealing with all aspects of it. And it has a very interesting impact. And the interesting impact relates to the projects themselves. People, look at biomethane and they say, well, it should be similar to, let's call it wind, solar, etc. But biomethane in itself is fundamentally different, not in the sense of that as an energy producing mechanism, but in terms of its structure. Like the risks in biomethane are higher. And it starts at the very start, which is your feedstock. In wind and solar, what you have is it's the shining sun and the blowing wind. When the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, they cost the same, which is essentially nothing. But the issue that you have with biomethane production is your feedstock. So you need to be able to guarantee in some way, shape, or form the availability and quality of your feedstock. So from a financing perspective, it's a risk that's not there in wind or solar. So you start off with a riskier proposition than those two, or let's call it other forms of renewables. And then you come to the next part, which is the sort of the construction of the and financing of the plant, or sorry, operating of the plant. Again, the operating of a biomethane plant is very different than having your wind farm up on the hill and having your solar panels in the fields. There's real expertise and technology required here. It's costlier to build and it's also costlier to operate. As I say, you do require an expertise. So as if those risks weren't sort of great enough all on their own, what the government has done, and this is the surprising part to me, is that they then layer on this other risk, and this other risk is that is about selling your product, and they're saying is that we won't support you in the sale of your product via feed-in tariffs or contracts for difference or whatever way it would work. We're going to leave you to the mercies of the market. So now you've got like this third risk, and what they seem to be relying upon, and it's been referred to before, is two things. One is the RHOs, and the other is the price of the EUAs. Now like the RHO thing, and it has been already said here, like there's little point in publishing this document if you haven't simultaneously published information on the RHO. Because you can't tell anything from it. As a financier, I'm literally looking, going, come back to me when you've got the information, such that I can evaluate the project. EUAs, and we know this from other projects, they're volatile. They've traded up over as high as 100 and down as low as 50. And then the other issue is that they're subject to regulatory interference insofar as that they place and take from the strategic reserve, as and when they deem fit, which is obviously a concern. Very hard to plan projects when there can be sort of, let's call it, interference in the market from state actors. the net point of all of that is that it fundamentally changes the project, and it actually fundamentally then changes the type of financing that you require. So if you take, so let's call it wind or solar or biomethane plants across Europe, they're typically funded by, let's call it institutional or investors such as pension funds or infrastructure funds. And what they want is long-term stable returns. That's what they want. Like, they're not interested in the fun part of the business. They want to see that they can get 20 years at 4%, something of that order, and they're quite happy. Banks can get involved as well because the banks are comfortable with the support mechanisms in place. However, what now has happened is that you when you take away the certainty, the one piece of certainty that is in biomethane in other jurisdictions, and replace that with uncertainty, you actually push your source of funding out to, let's call it, what they call private equity. And private equity are people or investors who expect higher returns. They take greater risks and they expect higher returns. And it's important to understand it's their expected return. So when they're modeling up the project, what they look at and they go, okay, so what have we got to take a bet on here? We've got to take a bet on the promoter. So they look at, someone like Declan and go, Declan's an experienced operator. He's built plants, he operates and knows what he's doing. Obviously a good guy to back. So that's your first point. Then they look at business strategy, and they're looking at business strategy in terms of how have you locked in your feedstock costs, and if you haven't locked in your feedstock costs, are your feedstock costs going to vary in line with your with the sales price that you're achieving for your end product? You can have both variable, you can have both fixed, but you can't have one variable and one fixed. The problem that someone like Declan will have is that when it comes time to look at long-term contracts outside of, let's call it government or state-sponsored ones, there's very few that have occurred. And that's a major problem. I saw one in France that has been done with IrBEA, but other than that, these are very limited in availability, and for the good reason, they're just not required. So what the government is saying is that there's a market going to develop in Ireland that hasn't developed anywhere else. Never mind price. It's just that this market's going to now occur. And obviously they're relying on the RHO to stimulate that. The next thing that they look at is just the economics of your business, and I've discussed that already about sort of security and availability and price of feedstock relative to the price of your end product, and then finally it's all to do with, let's call it, capital costs. And by capital costs, I mean, and Declan again has covered this in terms of the impact on grants, which is well known. And then there's the impact of time. Time is a real diminisher of returns. People think that, the longer, is that, cost is one issue, and certainly the higher the cost, yes, but the longer it takes, the worse it gets. And Ireland has a super poor record on being able to deliver infrastructure projects on time. So like there's a sort of a paradox here, and I'll finish with this, is that if you have driven your actors to your industry to private equity, their expectation is higher return, and higher return comes in the form of higher prices or lower costs. So that means you're expecting to get a higher price for your gas than is currently available, even allowing for green premiums, or you're going to drive costs down, and that has implications for farmers in terms of the supply of feedstocks. So the only solution that I could see to this now, and I'm looking at it going, that we have to deal with what's in front of us. Like, do I think that the government will change their stance? I don't know. There's people like on this panel and in the audience who have a better view than me. As an investor, we don't rely upon that. We just deal with what's in front of us. But where the government can help is by supplying the capital, not via grants, but via investment capital. So someone like ISIF can get involved in supplying equity, debt, whatever it is, effectively subsidized subsidised capital is maybe a route that the government might be considering, and we do deal with ISA from time to time, and they are very keen to get involved in such projects. The issue with it is that they usually need a matching investment, and they usually need matching terms, and the matching terms are going to come from private equity, and private equity have high expectations.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Declan. That's a very, very interesting insight into the whole dynamics of the funding and investment perspective. So thanks for that. We'll bring you in again in a couple of minutes. Next is Paul O'Brien. Paul is South Leinster chairman of the Irish Farmers Association. Paul has held many roles at county, regional, and national level within the IFA, and most recently was chair of the IFA Environment Committee. And now obviously is interested in this area in his new role as the South Leinster chairman. So Paul, farmers being the most important stakeholder in this, because if we don't have farmers involved, then there's no industry. What are your perspectives on all of this, and from what you've heard so far, and interesting to hear your feedback?
Okay, well, thanks, Sean, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak this morning. And I suppose really just to try to, I have been following this with great anticipation over the last number of years, waiting for this biomethane strategy to be one of the great hopes for Irish agriculture that will bring us out of kind of livestock farming and being able to produce food stock into a big, massive industry. I'm more worried today than I've ever been, if I'm being really, really honest. A number of things, I've always said that, the farmers cannot be the bottom of the pyramid. We can't be the ones who are the mainstay of this industry, but are not really rewarded for the work and for what we are able to bring to the party, in fact. A couple of things I just want to touch on, and it's great to listen to Paddy, Declan and Cathal as well, and given their perspective of how they believe this industry is going to be shaped. Obviously, when you looked at some of the figures that were presented at the recent Farmers Journal Roadshow, anybody with 9 million getting a return of 0.6%, I would be worried. I don't think that's going to, get many farmers, rushing into many of the high street banks to try to kind of, get a loan. So at that rate, I do feel that the size and scale of it is going to favour maybe the bigger developers. And from a farming perspective, I think that's going to be very, very frustrating. I would have always envisaged and hoped that this was the start of a brand new ability, like maybe the 1930s when the Irish Sugar Company was being built, that this was going to be an opportunity for farmers to get really invested in this and help to kind of bring an economic uplift in vast parts of the country. I don't see that, if I'm being honest. And just a point that Cathal made, and I think it's very, very feedstuffs stocks, that would be a considerable problem for us, because as everybody knows on the call, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the price of fertilizer, producing grass in 2021 was a completely different scenario than producing grass in 22, even without using fertilizer. So therefore, locked in feedstocks does get me kind of nervous and worried, because what we can't have is a farmer signing a contract with a supply with an AD plant operator and being held to that if so much fundamentals outside people's control have changed. Nervousness there, I must admit. But look, that's not to say that some mechanism couldn't be included. However, the problem is, if the price at the end to the ultimate consumer of the gas is not going to change, then the operator cannot take the loss and the farmer can't take the loss. So everybody in any part of industry needs to be rewarded for their work and their effort. And just looks other things, and they are key. And I suppose from a farmer's perspective, obviously this has been sold to farming as an opportunity to help the nitrates and the derogation problems that we have in farming from 170 to 220 now and 250 in other parts of the country. But the reality is that in order for this to work, this is going to be 2030 targets. We have another round of nitrates to get through in 2025 to see, can we get to a stage where this will be an advantage to us in 2030. There's other pressures on the climate action plan, as we know, big targets for forestry, big targets for tillage, big targets for nature restoration laws, and all of those are going to feed into, I suppose, farmers' ability to be able to, I suppose, engage in this fledgling industry. I take Declan's point. Look, any waste, the term waste should not be used when it comes to, this is a nutrient, whether it goes onto a farm or goes into an AD plant and comes back out of an AD plant. So as a result of that, I most certainly take his point. Other things as well, look, and I won't harp on about it. Like, we've all got mutual problems when it comes to planning, and whether that's at farm scale, building more capacity, whether it's going to be an AD, there is fundamental problems in the planning at the moment that doesn't seem to be really, speeded up, and that's a mutual problem for everybody in industry or anybody that's trying to conduct business. But look, I'm still hoping against hope that this will be the cavalier or the knight in shining armor to come and rescue farm incomes for everybody and make us all more viable. But at the moment, from what I've looked at and what I've read, and I suppose particularly after listening to everybody on the call this morning, I'm more nervous now, and we shouldn't be with what should be a brand new industry. This should have been a glorious opportunity that everybody could have met the needs, everybody could have had a certain amount of profit in the system, and we're doing ultimately good. The fact that we're actually displacing a fossil fuel should have been a major benefit for everybody. So, Seán, I am frustrated, but I do think there's an opportunity there, but it's how can a farmer maximise that opportunity, and that's going to be the challenge. And at the moment, I share with the rest of the callers and the participants that this is going to be a challenge. So back to you. Thanks, Seán.
Thanks very much, Paul. That's a very interesting perspective, and from an IrBEA perspective, we have always very clearly articulated, and we fundamentally agree with you, that everyone along the supply chain needs to get a fair return. It was one of our key principles in one of our initial documents back in 2019 or 2018. So it's a very, very important point. And I guess we can work, if we work from that basis, then we can hopefully move along to a potentially successful industry, with subject to amendment, potentially your update to the strategy. Noel, to bring you in, and thanks, Paul, for your contribution. Noel, to bring you in, and I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious that we have a number of questions in, which I would like to go to, but have you any overarching comments? And if you could keep it brief, that would be great, and we can bring you in on the questions, maybe to give your feedback in more detail. So, Noel, you're on mute there, if you want to unmute, and just a very high-level summary of maybe what you've heard so far, and your thoughts on the strategy.
Yeah, and just briefly to bring in, I know Paddy had asked a question on the red tree as well, directly to me. So in terms of that, there is discussions on Annex 9 and other parts of red tree. Look, in order to ensure we've got this is classified as renewable and we're not bringing in other materials. I mean, the question of palm oil coming in from other parts of the world, that's very questionable in source. We have to have a robust renewable energy directive, and the third iteration of it needs to be very sure on that. And there is discussions on at EU level on this at the moment. So we would say, look, in terms of the gas that we're using, we're able to stand over that. If it's coming from Irish farms, we have a lot of control over that. We can see what's actually happening on the ground, and it gives us a much clearer picture of what our actions are doing, and that they're having a full sustainable field in terms of what red tree requires. Look, I think going by what people are saying there, definitely, look, we need certainty on the pricing. Nobody can invest in this industry without certainty on the pricing. That's a clear thing. We had, going back 13, 14 years ago, when we were lobbying for REFIT 3, and we had identified within IrBEA, we had upwards, it was 40 megawatt of electrical capacity in biogas. This is plants that were in for planning or had got planning, which is the equivalent of about a terawatt hour. It never came about because the pricing was wrong. There was no certainty on when REFIT 3 did come in, it was far too low, and ultimately it wasn't built. We have Ireland is unique in the fact that we're seen as having substantial potential for AD on a per capita basis compared to the rest of Europe. Yet we're, I think, the lowest in Europe in terms of per capita installation of biogas. So there's something fundamentally wrong in how we're applying this policy. Like, we do welcome this paper, but where are we on time? Because 18 months ago, it would be good to be at this point. Because if you take it, if there's something announced, solid supports announced even today, give it 6 months for planning. You have a 5-year process then to try and get us to 2030. Like, we're into the second half of the decade in 6 months. So we're really against the clock on this. And if government are like, we welcome the document, it's good to see what they're saying the right things, but we need to see action on the ground in terms of the supports. And getting a solid support, there's a lot of questions over RHO and whether that's going to give us the certainty that's required. And I think that's one of the fundamentals of this. So I'll leave it over to Seán and over.
Okay, thanks very much. And just a reminder to all our attendees, if you would like to submit a question, we're at nearly at 11:15. We did say we'd finish by 11:15. We might run on for a couple of minutes just to take some of the questions. There are quite a number of questions have come through. The first question from an anonymous attendee, this document has been pushed by the Department of Agriculture very strongly. The budget is Department of Agriculture. Where is Minister Eamon Ryan on the rollout of the industry? So any thoughts on that? So I don't know who wants to take that one, or does anyone want to take that one? It kind of is a fundamental point. We have seen the Department of Ag, in fairness, push this strongly.
If I can come in on that one, Seán, if that's okay.
Yes, Paddy.
And apologies, my Zoom tripped me out there just as I was wrapping up. But yeah, fundamentally the point I made towards the end, which got lost when I got dropped off, was on that second slide, which hopefully showed up, it mentioned the sustainability charter. And you and I both know that from our interactions with Minister Ryan over the past number of years, his primary concern, and there is no point in us, tippy-toeing around the point. His primary concern is the sustainability of the production of the feedstock. And his key point is that he does not want to contravene the current nitrate limitations and cause an additional eutrophication of waters over and above already caused by existing practices. So the concern that he certainly has noted is that he does not want us to be producing gas like we do milk, and therefore overproduce nutrients that run off into our hedgerows and waterways. And that's the fundamental point. And I think addressing that, you can see it in the strategy. It clearly states sustainability charter for the project. So that links it into the production of feedstock from less nutrient intensive. So the idea that we can produce 16 or 18 tons of dry matter of grass for biogas is something he's clearly not going to support. And that's where we see the multi-species swards, the clovers, the other elements that are less required of, again, fossil-based. And Paul is be aware of where this is coming from. It is something we have to face up to. However, we know and we fundamentally appreciate, and Paul will know, as a part-time farmer myself, we can and do manage. I often use the example of tillage. If you put too much nutrients on a tillage crop, the tillage crop will fall over. So nature is a natural restrictor in itself, but it is a key concern of his. And I think as part of a response to this strategy, we should have a coherent approach to how that. The other item Cathal touched on there was, the feedstock security. Paul touched on it around variability on price. So, fundamentally, we have to understand this, but I think that's been a key plank of the resistance, per se.
And Paul, would you care to comment on that maybe, just because it is an important thing, consideration, the question about Minister Ryan's involvement more so than the Department of Ag being a driver of this, or be seen as a driver of this anyways?
Well, look, the Climate Action Plan is a whole of government approach, and it's easy just to delegate it to one individual minister and one department. But, this has multiple benefits. So really, maybe it should be the Department of the Taoiseach who looks after everything and delegates it down. And we've often had problems where it just goes to one department and it just hits a brick wall and nothing happens. But look, the reality is that in order for this to work, all of the government has to be involved. I would say there's even a place here for even Darragh O'Brien, Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government for planning. There's all of these people. So just delegating it to one individual ministry or department is probably wrong. But unless there's some sort of czar overseeing everybody. But really, look, the point is that yes, and Paddy touched on it, and I'm going to put it a different way, maybe less diplomatically as Paddy, but it was seen as another form of expansion. It was seen another form of kind of like dairy expansion. Now the plan is less, farms that are not producing as much grass normally. Now, as I say, there's massive pressures on those farms anyway to do other things, forestry, to do tillage. So the challenge will be to entice enough farmers. We need the best parts of 330,000 acres of feedstock coming in. And it is a lot, really, when you look at things like that. And farmers need a certain amount of certainty. So we need it, and we need it done properly. It can't be mismanaged, and all the government approach is the way to do it.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Will there be any amendments to CRU payback times for gas lines from 10 to 25 years? The gas networks Ireland pipeline cost is detrimental to plant rollout. That's just more maybe of a comment than a question, but if there's anyone would care to address that, I don't know. Does anyone want to talk to that point? We have covered some of that already. Cost of connection to grid. Okay, we'll keep going. If someone wants to come in on that in the subsequent answers, then fair enough. Shane, question from Shane. Thanks for joining, Shane. Consider the delay in the publication of what he calls a generic strategy. How long will it take to realise the 25 specific actions, which seems to be critical to the biomethane industry? So, Declan, would you like to comment on that? There's a lot of actions in the report. So, what would your thoughts be from an actions perspective in terms of delivery of those? Like, they're all set out to be 2024. Most of them 2024 and early 2025. It seems like an awful lot of work to be done in a short period of time, but it is necessary. Do you want to comment on that?
I suppose my overriding comment on all of the from timelines from start to finish is 2024, 2025 is not achievable for a single project in Ireland, regardless of how much I get paid for gas at the end or how much I get for feedstock at the front end. Somebody, I think, said earlier on, one of the comments were, well, you'll need 6 months for planning. I absolutely and categorically guarantee you will need a minimum of 12 months for planning. You will need a minimum of 11 months to build a plant. So nothing's going to happen. Nothing can't happen.
Okay. Any other one would like to comment on the actions and the timelines around the actions? Noel, any comment?
Yeah, just on that. I suppose with the 6 months, I meant to actually prepare it for people are on a kick-off point. But yeah, and it's anywhere from a year to 5 years after that point. When you get to start building, you're more or less there, to be honest with you, in one of these projects. Okay. I think more so on that. Look, the specific application, we've so many things to get in line. But as Marie Donnelly said at our conference last October, she defied us to build 10 houses by 2030, never mind 200 biogas plants. And this is a fundamental issue with our planning process. So we need to try and see, and it's affecting not only obviously biogas, so many other aspects, but it is the environment that we're working in now. And it really points out that planning is going to be a problem that may be sorted out by other means, but we need to get the policies in place for biogas and all the other policies that can be put in place, such as the sports, as quickly as possible, and really and truly should be done at this stage, because if in the current lifetime of this government, which is less than a year left, it's difficult to see what is going to be achieved in that time.
Paddy, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Seán. I think just a critical action, really, and it's something maybe IrBEA can lead, and maybe through Renewable Energy Ireland and the Heat Forum or the Transport Forum. If we can annotate all of the actions as per the strategy, and we can allocate the responsible body to them, and we all just get big sticks It's worked very well in the solar. It's worked very well in the wind. It's worked very well generally. And if everyone who has an interest in this in terms of be it through the feedstock side as farmers, or be it through farmers developing small plants, or be it the larger developers who are going to need partnerships with large cohorts of landowners, a joined up approach rather than a splintered one from multiple actors with a coherent list, bring the voices together, give this the time it needs over the next 6 to 18 months, and hopefully either through this government or the next, there is a very strong foundation stone being placed. There are multiple elements to be added on top of this. And if we do it in a coordinated and coherent fashion with a common and really effective messaging, I think the actions will get delivered more quickly that are required to unlock the various aspects that are required to cover all of the stuff that we've touched on. So both the list from today's webinar, but also a list from the strategy in terms of the steps, and a consistent, you've seen it ourselves, Seán, if you take that consistent approach and you continue to push, you will move it faster than it would move of its own accord.
Okay. Cathal, I think there's someone here, Brian actually, saying you're fantastic, laying out the real viability challenges for big projects. Now that we have a government strategy, how can the strategy be changed to make it viable and realistic, or is this for the next government? So I don't know, do you want to comment on that, Cathal, or is more of a question for maybe generally as well? But do you want to comment on that, Cathal?
No, well, yes, I can comment. I mean, I'm no great expertise in government policy. I mean, I think the key failings have already been highlighted here.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I mean, it always strikes me as a changing government policy once it's set out is, you know, like is a mammoth task. They can tinker at the edges. Maybe they make amendments out through time, but it's very hard to take them off course. And particularly as outlined, you know, if Minister Ryan has a specific issue, if he has a specific issue with regard to the sustainability of the feedstock, it sort of strikes me, then that's one issue you got to address straight up, because you just, you know, if that's his fundamental objection, nothing else matters. But, you know, I would go back to you know, to that if they're not going to provide a price support, like and we all agree that the existing capital support is you know, at best irrelevant and at worst counterproductive, then you have to think up, you know, have to start thinking what other support can help here. And you can certainly do that by going back to the first point, which is trying to address the sustainability issue. And then the second thing is get other state actors who have lots of capital involved and see what they can do, you know, in terms of, let's call it, subventing or subsidizing, you know, the construction of plants and de-risking it for other, let's call it, private investors. That can help, like, you know, sort of public-private partnerships, that type of thing. But that's about as far as it goes from, you know, from me. I wouldn't have any expertise.
Okay. Another question here. The design of the RHO can solve some of the issues raised. If the RHO only allows indigenous fuels, it will ensure sustainability and a route to market for biomethane producers at a price required to guarantee a return. IrBEA and others need to lobby for a strong RHO, including penalty buyout clause. It's more of a comment, I suppose, and we are lobbying very strongly. We've already provided 2 very comprehensive, detailed responses to the department around the RHO through the consultations they have been rolling out. What we were very disappointed to see was that our submission, and maybe Noel, you can come in and comment on this, our submission to the first consultation, we felt that the second design, the parameters of the second consultation around the design, actually went in the opposite direction to what we had actually requested in terms of making the RHO effective and meaningful. The threshold level increased, the ambition didn't change, and there was a lot of other elements which went in the opposite direction. So we remain to be convinced around the RHO, but we'll work hard to ensure that it is a mechanism by which the industry can be developed. So Paddy and Declan want to come in there very briefly, lads. We're coming to the end. So Declan first and then Paddy.
Okay, thanks, Seán. No, just a quick comment from me. The original document produced before the last public consultation clearly identified the expected market cost you would need to get for gas in order to make things sustainable and economic going forward. So I think quite clearly the penalty for not using indigenous renewable gas should be set at twice the cost of indigenous renewable gas.
Yes.
It's not rocket science.
Yes, and that's a key component. And the other, what are the other critical components, Noel? Threshold?
Well, look, the threshold itself has increased. I think it's 1,000 gigawatt hours. So basically, you need to be a supplier supplying. I think we estimated around the size of County Kilkenny before you're obliged to partake in that. So effectively, I mean, it's about 10% of the entire gas grid. I mean, there'd be a vast swathe of people not required to get the RHO. The devil is in the detail on it. If it's done wrong, it's just not going to work at all. We've seen that with the biofuel obligation scheme, where when it was initially set up back again a good few years ago, we had 8 suppliers of biofuels in the country. 7 of them closed overnight as a result of the scheme not being suitable to support indigenous. So and we're very clearly pointing out with our consultation, there's lots of points in terms of the threshold levels, in terms of the bio clauses, in terms of what fuels are eligible, and loads of other criteria there that they really need to move on. And unfortunately, the second consultation that they brought out seemed to have less background knowledge than the first one. So it really needs to move forward rather than backwards.
There's a number of other questions, but unfortunately we won't just get to them because of time constraints. I'll just have give you all literally 30 seconds to sum up. So maybe if I start with you, Paul, do you want to just summarize your main asks or your main feedback or whatever you'd just like to say?
Okay, Seán, and look, and I've always said before, I don't be the controversial one on any webinar or any conference, but I have to be a realist, and the realist is that we need to deliver a secure farm incomes to keep rural Ireland viable. So I'm never apologetic on that. But it's just, look, when something is being designed, there is an ideal opportunity for all stakeholders to be able to design something that's mutually beneficial for everybody. We are starting a new industry. But if farmers are not going to be rewarded for that, then this industry is going to be in trouble before it starts. So, I think locked in feeds prices and things like that, that is a challenge. So therefore, there's other points in the industry that need to be pushing more for the final price. But we're price takers, and if we're developing a new industry, we can't be the bottom of the pyramid again. We have to be there with a key locked-in profit for what we do. Otherwise, farmers just won't engage on it. And thanks for your time today, Seán.
Totally agree, and thanks very much, Paul. Yes, Noel, do you want your concluding remarks very briefly?
Yeah, look, I think on that we need certainty. The industry needs certainty on pricing and on the market is going to be there for us. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves, whatever cost comes in at, we didn't jump at this 15 years ago, and as a result, we don't have a biogas industry here in this country. If it was done so, the investment cost today would be a lot less required to get us to that level. So we have to, from a policy point of view, jump in Ireland at some point, because we're way behind the rest of Europe at this point in time.
Okay, Cathal, final comment from you, please.
Yes, super short. I mean, they've layered on risk where they should have de-risked, and now they need to find a way to de-risk projects if they're going to attract finance. And if they can't de-risk it enough, then the state needs to get involved in providing finance in conjunction with private investors.
Okay, thanks very much. Declan?
Thanks, John. Yeah, very, very final quick comment. From listening to everybody here on the webinar this morning, the finance say there's nothing in it to make it. The developers, i.e. me, say there's nothing in it to make it work. And more importantly, the farmers who are going to be involved in both supplying feedstock and taking digestate say it won't work. So I think it's reasonable to assume it won't work.
Okay, Paddy, final comment from you, and then we'll give an overarching final conclusion. Paddy.
Yeah, thank you, Seán. I think fair point that we're saying that the strategy doesn't work, but at the same time, it's the first foundation stone in acceptance that it has a role to play. So rather than criticize it, let's get in amongst the department, let's get in amongst those who have developed this and put the work into it and try and unpick these various aspects. I think when And if the RHO details are announced, then we can really put some apply pressure to the policy as to where it can or cannot work. So I think that's a positive, and let's not leave it as a complete negative. I think there's a positive there that we've started. We planted the seed. Now we need to help it grow.
I agree, Paddy, and I think that was the essential message within our press statement, which we issued earlier or late last week. You know, we welcome the strategy, a good first step, but certainly a lot further work required for the role and the requirements of the industry to be realised. So at that, I'd just like to conclude. Thanks to Paul, thanks to Cathal, Noel, Declan, and Paddy. Also, thanks to Teresa for working behind the scenes to get all this organised. Sorry we've ran over in time. Also, thanks to our huge attendance this morning with a record crowd. We've lost some people in the last 15 minutes, I suppose, due to maybe other meetings and commitments, but with a huge number of registrations and attendees this morning. So thank you all for joining us this morning. And as I said, a recording of this will be available. And we and the Irish Bioenergy Association look forward to working with you all, including financiers, farmers, developers, and our broader membership to try and affect change in terms of updates to this document, which will see it delivering for a successful industry for all. So thanks very much to everyone. We'll conclude on that, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye-bye.